Okay, so this is the second part of the first interactive project that I'm doing, and I've received some really great suggestions from some of you, the subscribers or viewers, and so I've got some idea about how I'm going to progress forward with this piece of work now. So some of the suggestions that I've had have been from, for example, the first one is Video Bytes NL, and they've suggested that I should do some kind of furry or soft creature elements perhaps in there, rather than sort of like the hard edge shapes with very smooth surfaces. Maybe I could add some more kind of moss-like texture in there maybe. Anthony Joseph, thank you very much for suggesting maybe that we could be looking up from under the water. Maybe sort of looking up and you'll see sort of the ocean or the top of the waves from underneath maybe. August has suggested that maybe I could do like bone and flower structures, which is really quite interesting as well. And Agradaville has suggested that maybe do some kind of stony or craggy surrounding features with branches and maybe some self-lit flowers in there as well. And I've had quite a few suggestions or comments that there is a kind of chicken head going off in this area. I'm not entirely convinced that that's what I'm going to move forward with, but I can see exactly what people mean by that anyway. I think I might try to avoid that. I don't want to make it a comical piece of work, although, to be honest, once you've seen it, it's difficult to unsee something like that. But still, I'm going to move forward with some of these suggestions now. I don't still know really at this point what I'm going to end up with. And obviously, those suggestions are words rather than visual sources. So when someone writes, for example, that I should do bone or flower structures, how they imagine it is not necessarily how it's going to end up. So we'll see. I'm going to take some of those suggestions and try and incorporate some element of them anyway. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the background, and I want to probably go with some kind of underwater theme, and I want to make the background quite dark, I think, for now. The reason I'm going for quite a dark background is because I'm thinking I want to create another layer above the drawing, and I think I'm going to start adding some paler elements into this. I want to kind of make them almost like bone structures, but I also want to give them a slight translucency. So what I'm going to do first of all is create a layer above the drawn layer, and I'm going to choose, it's almost a yellowy orange, but quite a sort of pale yet whiter version of that. I'll just show you here the kind of colour that it creates. It's not quite white, it's just a little bit off, almost like a kind of creamy, kind of milky kind of colour really. I'm not going to turn the opacity up to full, and the brush I'm going to keep quite small as well, but not too fine. And what I'm going to start to do is just to gradually build up on top of the drawn layer and start to create the sense that the edges, because a lot of these shapes are like tubes, and because they're translucent, the edges will appear to pick up more light than the centre. So the centre of the shape will be more transparent and you'll see through. So if it has a dark colour or even a light colour on the background to it, you'll see that coming through. But the edges are the places where you probably get like a concentration of the light that's been picked up from the surrounding areas. So I'm just going to work my way around parts of the image, just trying to create a sense that the edges of some of the forms has a concentration of the light that's gone through. There might be some areas that later on I need to darken up because it becomes quite dense and opaque and doesn't let any light through at all. But to begin with, I want to create the sense that there is a kind of translucency to these forms. So I guess I'm imagining some kind of light source coming from maybe above and slightly behind these forms. Not that that will be the only light source, but for the moment that's the only one that I'm really taking into consideration. I think what I will also do is create a layer underneath that layer, and I'm going to choose like in fact I'll save the colour that I've just been using. I do have a random palette here, I'm not really using any of those colours, but I'm going to choose a slightly warmer and a darker colour to go underneath it. And on the layer that's underneath it, I'm going to start applying that colour just to add a bit more depth underneath that colour as well. So it's not going to interfere with the lighter colours underneath, it's just going to give it a bit more of a range of depth and tone. going to create a layer on top of that. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit because now I'm going to start adding a bit more refinement to some of these areas. I try not to zoom in too often and too much, but obviously for some of the finer details it is going to be necessary. I just want to sharpen up some of the edges, and then I'm soon going to start adding some of the kind of the hair and the fur details as well. So obviously I'm allowing some of the background colours and the blue details to show through, and that's going to help with the effect of translucency, but I'm also going to allow some of the forms that go behind it to almost carry on, so you can see the continuation of them as well. Subtly, but it will help create that illusion that there is a sense of translucency, and there will be some other details later on that have maybe a strong light source of their own that you will start to see go behind things and show through things. So that again will further help the effect, I hope, anyway. Again, I'm not copying from anything, so I'm kind of trusting that the effect will work at the end. Partly it's, having done plenty of observational work in the past and been able to sort of take some of those lessons and apply them into this kind of setting, but sometimes you just got to have a go, see if you can figure it out as you go along, and that inevitably means sometimes you make some mistakes and have to undo parts. And I'm sure you'll see me backtrack and delete things, adjust things, erase things as I go. Now normally I'd hope to be able to do as much of this in camera as possible. It just so happens it's a summer break now from my teaching and I'm going on holiday as of tomorrow, so I'm going to try and get as much done of this now in camera. And like I say, normally I would try and do most of it in camera and show that the following weekend. On this occasion I'm going to do as much as I can now, and then if I need to update you in another couple of weeks when I return with the finished version that I've been able to do on the move, and that's the way I'll have to do it on this one occasion. But like I say, it's going to be a little bit different because I'm going on holiday. But I'm going to Bali and I'm hoping that I'll see something really inspiring there, because I'm going to go snorkeling. Probably not scuba diving, but I'm certainly going to go snorkeling, so I may well see some interesting underwater creatures, some underwater life. But who knows, it may end up inspiring a future piece, or indeed this one. But I'm going to do as much as I can now, and then maybe in another week or two we'll get the kind of conclusion of it. Normally I'm going to be producing a video every week, at least one a week, but like I say, I'm not going to be able to take my setup here and film while I'm on holiday, and I've really not had the chance to do any more in advance and get them in the bank, as it were. So I can only apologise with a little bit of break in normal weekly releases of videos, but I will, as soon as I get back, I'm going to come back refreshed, hopefully, and continue producing more videos. The long-term plan, when I spoke on the first part of this video about perhaps doing a drawing on the Saturday and then releasing the kind of progress video on the Wednesday and then the final version on the following Saturday, I've had a bit of a rethink on that already. Like I say, this is the first kind of time that I'm doing this properly. I've had time to reflect on that kind of schedule, and I've come to the conclusion that what would work better is if I show you the doodle on the Saturday, the drawing on the Saturday, get the input from people, and then give myself a week to do a proper job of it, as much as I possibly can in camera. But what I'll also do on the following weekend, I'll show you the results on the Saturday, and then I'll release another video on the Sunday, which will be another drawing. So I'm planning from now on to do a video on a Saturday that is the kind of evolution of this video, and then on the Sunday there'll be a drawing that sets up for the following Saturday, where you see the finished painting on a Saturday. I expect that the Saturday videos will be more in depth, where you see a full painting taking place. There'll be a longer video, and then on the Sunday one will be a shorter video where it's just about the drawing, and then hopefully get your input. That gives me a week, or almost a week then, from the Sunday when the doodle or the drawing is released, and I get feedback over the week, and then by the Saturday hopefully we'll have had chance to work on it and show you what I've managed to do. Like I say, I work full time, do teaching full time, so I'm going to try and stick to that schedule as much as I possibly can, and I think I will. But if on the odd occasion we have exams or other priorities that are urgent, then I might have to do as much as I can, but we'll see. I'm just going to go back to that layer that's underneath where I've got some of the darker tones, and you'll probably notice I've chosen an even darker colour. I'm going to start adding some quite dark browns then underneath. I do want these forms to be quite warm generally, as a way of contrast to the background. Like I say, in the areas where they're going to be very translucent, you'll get the blue showing through, but when they're sort of a denser, more opaque version of themselves, then they're going to be a kind of warmer version. Perhaps that's too much. So it's probably more going to be the extremities, the bits that are on the edge, bits that stick out from the forms that are going to be the most translucent. So as you can see here, I'm using a darker colour, but I'm not totally obliterating the blue that's behind it. I've got it on quite a low opacity, and there will be areas where I get a concentration of that, but then there's certain areas where I want the blue to show through as well. Anyway, I'm going to go back to the top layers because I'm not quite sure where I'm going with that yet, so I'll return to the highlights. I'll have to work into those a bit more again. I'm going to create another layer, but this time underneath the drawing. I want to darken up this bottom area, but I don't want to destroy the drawing necessarily. So just try and get the balance right. So it's going to be darker than the other parts of the drawing, but I'll still be able to see the lines of the drawing, the original sort of sketch underneath everything. So in the darker areas I can use perhaps a darker version of that colour. So it's not quite going to be the highlights here, it's going to be a slightly darker brown, so I can use that for these areas. And you can see I'm doing some kind of longer hairs here too. Right, I feel at this point like I need to introduce something a little bit different, so I'm going to start thinking about adding a real bright colour. So I'm going to add something quite warm into the scene, so I'm going to go for quite a strong red, quite a faint version of that, so I've turned the opacity down, but I'm going to start adding some kind of warmth into maybe certain areas, so there's sort of buried features taking place. I even have some, perhaps an area where it's concentrated, maybe it grows and kind of branches from here, extends to these areas, maybe it's kind of like a vein network perhaps, or like coral, but it's illuminated. So I'm not quite sure how this is going to pan out, but if I just start to get some suggestion of it in place for now. Now it's underneath, importantly, it's underneath the layers that I've already done. Now there will be areas where perhaps with an extra layer I'll do it over the top, but it always was the intention to have a sense of translucency to these forms, so when things go inside and behind it, you're going to see them, but they need to be obscured by some of the things that I've already planned for to be over the top. So maybe when they get up to the top here that they emerge out the other side. Now what I'm going to do is just, when I want to intensify the kind of light effect, I'm going to add sort of gradually more from orange to yellow Maybe the areas where it's got a real concentration of the red, where there's a lot of it bunched together, like here, maybe at the source. So we're going to get more of a brighter area. Maybe in here as well, something going on, maybe amongst this area. So you can see I've added a bit of pink just to vary up the colour scheme a little bit. I found that if you just sort of stick to orange, red and yellow, it gets a bit monotonous, a bit boring, whereas just giving it a touch of maybe like a pink in there as well just makes the overall look a bit more interesting, adds a bit more of a dynamic range to the colours. I can also experiment with this layer by moving it up through the layers and see if it works better somewhere higher up in the mix. It may well be the case that I think it looks better here or better the layer underneath. I can always erase bits where I want to obscure it slightly more, but I can pick and choose where I put it exactly in the layers. So I think just for the sake of being able to see it very clearly, I'm going to have it higher up in the layers for now, and then I might try moving it further down or erasing certain areas that I don't want to be quite as prominent. But for this stage of just seeing what I'm doing, I think it's quite useful to have it high up in the mix. I think I'll move it down a layer. That seems to work a little bit better. If I move it down again, it seems to obscure too much of it. So I think a layer above is just about right. There might be one or two bits that I need to just soften the effect of, but I think that feels generally about the best sort of area for it to exist. There'll be some details like this, for example, where perhaps on an upper layer, I need to just resolve an area where I want it to go over the top of another detail. But sometimes layers get a bit messy like that, not everything exists on the logical kind of placement for it, but you just have to find your way with it a little bit. I think if you know exactly what you're doing from the outset, then it's easy to keep it more logical, but with something like this where I'm finding my way, then there's a little bit of just adjust as you go. And now what I can do, now it's starting to get a bit more of a kind of logic in there, I can work on some of the layers that are on top and I can start to obscure certain details as appropriate. So if there's something here, for example, that needs to go over the top, then it'll help just sort of knock back some of those details too. So as well as the light that's coming from somewhere else, I've obviously got the light that's coming from here. So I can use some of those warmer colours perhaps and create a sense that they are diffusing light in the whole area perhaps. Maybe more of an orange. I feel like I want to darken up one of the layers that are underneath just to see if it changes the feel. Yeah, I think that seems to work better. I'm just going to have a look at the other layers too. In fact, I think I do prefer that. I'm going to darken up the layer that has all the light and all the kind of red veins growing in it. I think that there are some areas perhaps that do work better if they are darker and adds a bit of a silhouette against the background. You can see the difference there, and I can always, on the next layer above, go over some of these details. In fact, what might be a good idea is even to duplicate that layer and maybe darken up the layer that's on the top, like so. And then if I want to, then just on certain areas of it, for example with the eraser, I might decide that I do want some of the lighter areas in this area, this part, so I can just take away some of the darker edge for this detail. So I've benefited from the darker in certain parts, like up here, but then when I still want it to be light, I can just erase the dark version that I've overlaid on top. I hope that makes sense. That's the darker version that's on top, but I've erased certain sections to reveal the version that's underneath. So that's as it was originally, and now it's sort of counterbalanced. So you've got the lighter parts and then you've got the darker sort of veins that go above. So that's the effect without having darkened up bits, and that's the effect with. So there might be certain bits that I want to continue to raise the dark a bit over the top and just reveal some of the lighter colours, but there's definitely some bits that I feel that are somewhat enhanced by that effect. I'm going to create a layer on top just for the purpose of wanting perhaps to, as I said earlier, just redefine some of these sections that perhaps go above here. Previously it was obscured. If I just show you, because of the way I've done things in layers, it was going behind the kind of highlight from the object that actually goes behind it, so I need it to be more prominent than that and go in front. Likewise a shape like this. I'm going to use this kind of colour, but a darkened version, perhaps not that dark, to start adding some hairs that maybe have picked up some of the highlights from here. You just have to be careful with these because you don't want to go overboard. Okay, I think at this stage I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with the highlights. I feel like I need to make a decision on the background layer before I can really start showing the impact that the light would be having. So I'm going to create a layer. I'm going to put it underneath everything, but obviously it goes above the background. Now the purpose of this layer is to really focus in on the blues of the scene and really start maybe adding some ripples, so maybe we can see the surface here, so maybe it's like coral or some kind of life that's not too far down in the ocean or the water, and maybe you can just see quite a lot of the ripples and the water above. So I think I want something like maybe a bit more of a greeny blue. Let's just test that out. Yeah, that will do. Maybe a lower opacity version, maybe slightly darker to begin with. I just want to start making some broken kind of textures initially. So I need to decide the size of the band of broken water perhaps, so maybe it goes down to about here and then doesn't go below that, because obviously just like perspective on a horizon, you're going to get like a vanishing point or some kind of line at least where the sky disappears and the land begins. It's similar to that, so maybe get some of the really smaller broken pieces around here, because they would represent the more distant kind of shapes, and then as they get higher up it'll be closer, so those sort of forms, those ripples in the water. In fact, I'm going to change the brush to a medium airbrush, so these forms will be, or the breaks in the water will be bigger. Hopefully that'll become more apparent as I go along. I will do a lighter colour over the top of this, but just to begin with I'm going to do it with this kind of greeny blue. So I'm concentrating on the gaps between the shapes almost as much as I am the forms that I'm adding. So maybe you get bigger shapes where they all merge together a little bit more. You can always blur this out or use the smudge tool to get rid of any obvious brush marks at the end. Just want to start piecing it together, getting a feel for the kind of forms. So maybe the light's going to be more focused in the centre. So wherever the light's coming from, maybe the sun's up here and it's more of a central feature. So all the brighter colours are going to be concentrated in this middle area. And already I think perhaps you can see that the light being here is making a bit more sense of these kind of areas too, because there is a light hitting it, so it's got to come from somewhere. So a lot of these shapes are going to be kind of fatter in the centre. So you might get a shape that's bulges in the centre of it and then it gets finer, thins out at the edges of it. You might get an overlap of one or two of those kind of forms too. So maybe create a sense, and maybe that there's a slight curve here increases the sense that you've got a real space. It focuses the eye more into the centre part as well. There may well be brushes and effects that if you look through here there may be, but I'm more interested in being able to do it manually by hand, and if you understand how to construct these kind of things, I think it's better than being over-reliant upon brushes. Once you understand exactly what it is you're aiming for, then maybe you can find a brush that does the job perfectly for you, but until that point I think it's important to learn how to do it properly. So So you can see the shapes are getting smaller near the bottom. Some of them will be merging together, and that's fine. So then what I'll do is I'll go over some of these areas that are there's quite a lot of concentration of the pale blue, and I can go over it with a white and add even more broken textures in there with the white. In fact, I'll do that now. I'll create another layer to go on top of that. I'm going to put some real pale colours onto it now. And this really is going to start helping to make sense of some of those effects that I'm adding to the forms too. So like I said, in this centre area, this is where I'm going for the brightest colours. And I might even do some rays of light that are coming down from it as well in a short while. So now that I know the general kind of colour scheme and how bright it goes, see, I'm not going to do this just yet, but I'm just going to demonstrate the idea. On the layers that are on the top, I can perhaps use some of the intensity of that light and really start bringing it onto some of these forms a little bit as well. And also some of the blueness perhaps into there, but I'm not quite at that stage yet, so I won't do that to those layers. I'm going to concentrate and continue on the water for now. And now I've added a bit more white, I can go back to the layer underneath and perhaps just add some more of that pale blue underneath certain bits of it. Perhaps I can go for a stronger version of it, I think. Add a bit more colour in there. I think I'll create another layer, and on this layer I'm going to do something between the white and the blue, and I'm going to try do it with the soft airbrush. I'm going to try to create the effect of sort of light beams coming down. But I don't want to go overboard with this, but I just want to create just a hint. Perhaps as it gets closer to the edges, there'll be more blue than white, maybe even more. Don't want too many of them actually. And you can see I'm kind of doing a bit of a kind of perspective, a bit of a vanishing point. So imagine one way further up, presumably where the light comes from, the sun. I'm also doing sort of thinner beams that seem to maybe originate from some of these distant forms. So when they get nearer to you get wider, more diffuse beams, but then maybe more concentrated ones, narrow ones, where they come from the kind of, it's not a horizon line, but I guess it is in a sense, even though we're talking about underwater features. And that also gives me the cue perhaps to maybe go back to the white layer and really focus maybe just a point of light in and around where the beams are coming from. And this is something I would continue to refine, but the main purpose was just to help understand what we've got in the foreground, give it some context. And I feel like it has done that. I feel like it makes more sense now. It looks more like coral. The lighting that's on it now looks wrong, which is sometimes really useful because it gives you the ability to see what would be right for it. So now I can go back to my upper layer and I can start using the colour scheme that I've got now to start adding the kind of the highlights that would be appropriate for this scene now. So you can see I've got a very pale blue now, which I can use on the edges of some of these forms because they are obviously going to be reflecting what is in the scene. I can also create whole new highlights that I didn't have before because I didn't know where the light was coming from and I didn't know what colour it would be at the time, but now I do. And I know it's quite strong and I know it's coming from the centre, so I can really go to town with some of the highlights at this point. For me, this is the bit where it really starts to come to life. When you have an environment and an object and the two interplay, that's when you start to really, for me, start to create a believable kind of environment and a believable scene. And that's really what I enjoy, is figuring out the logic and then making everything kind of make sense. So previously I had quite a warm kind of beige hint to the highlights, and now you can see I've got this blue colour scheme, so I'm starting to go over some of the highlights and just give them a bit more of a blue tint, more of a blue emphasis. I mean, in places it might be necessary to even just focus it up and do a white as well. But again, it's not everywhere in the surface, so it shouldn't be everywhere on the forms either. So I'm going to use that blue colour, and I'm going to use it to begin adding some kind of hairs. Now that I have a strong highlight, I know exactly where to put the hairs and how bright to make them. Just going to go back to the layer where it has all the kind of vein structures and the light, and I'm just going to intensify some of the yellows in there just to make it look more like it really glows in areas, especially down here where it sort of emanates from, maybe inside these pods as well, these areas. I've also got the darker layer over the top of the vein, so I can perhaps just add some on top of that layer as well. I don't want to overkill it, I just want to intensify it in select areas. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for today's video, but that is not the end of this painting. Like I say, in future ones in this series, I'm going to have a bit longer to devote to it on future videos to get it to a higher finish. But I just wanted to get as much done as I could today, and then when I return from my holiday from Bali in a couple of weeks, I'll show you the end results and I'll set up the next project with a sketch as well, and then hopefully we'll get more in depth in future ones. But I just wanted to get started in the time that I've got, give you a sense of an environment, incorporate some of the suggestions. So as mentioned earlier, I've tried to incorporate some kind of furry element. I think I'll add more of that, perhaps take this with me and continue on holiday. I wanted to do, as was suggested by somebody else, Anthony Joseph, maybe looking up at the ocean from underneath, and these self-illuminated kind of, not quite flowers as it turned out, and some craggy rocks, but I've tried to interpret some of those suggestions anyway, and that's exactly what I'll do in future drawings. So I hope you found it interesting to watch this experiment, this journey on this particular video. I'll show you the end results in a couple of weeks, and I'll set up the next project then too. Like I say, it's unusual this time because of the holiday, creating a bit of a break and a bit of a delay, but normally I'll do one of these every single week, and that's the plan. So please look through my playlist. I do lots of how-to tutorials as well as these, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people that are supporting me over at my Patreon page, and you can find more information about that down in the description. Thanks very much for watching. I shall catch you back here again.